Greetings. Welcome to the fourth lecture in SHI's lecture series on Alaska Native subsistence, entitled The Significance of Subsistence Sharing by Dr. Steve Langdon. I am Chuck Smythe, Director of the Culture and History Department. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. As you watch the lecture, we invite you to post questions in the chat box in YouTube. Dr. Langdon has graciously agreed to answer questions at the end of his presentation. Dr. Langdon is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at UAA, where he taught for 38 years. He has conducted anthropological research projects throughout Alaska with a focus on pre-contact, historic, and contemporary fisheries of the Tlingit and Haida people. He has also conducted substantial research on subsistence practices of Alaska Natives, fisheries policies and their impacts on Alaska Natives, regulatory policies related to Alaska Native marine mammal hunting, traditional and ethno-historical topics of Tlingit society, as well as contemporary social and cultural dimensions of Alaska Native life. He has received the Bullock Award from the University of Alaska Foundation for his excellence in contributions to Alaska, and the Alaska Federation of Natives Denali Award for his contributions to Alaska Native rural communities. He is the author of the widely used The Native Peoples of Alaska, Traditional Living in a Northern Land. Dr. Langdon.
Good afternoon and welcome all you Zoomers out there. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Dr. Rosita Worrell of the Sealaska Heritage Institute for the invitation to prepare this research and to present this my findings through this lecture. Hopefully in the future it will be published as well. I'd also like to thank Dr. Chuck Smythe for his informative and positive introduction. The topic today is the significance of sharing subsistence resources in sustaining Alaska Native communities and maintaining Alaska Native culture. In order to discuss this topic, we need to have a little background on Alaska Native cultural characteristics.
Steve, you need to share the screen.
What?
You need to share the screen.
Oh God. Share screen, okay, and show, go up here, share screen. Are we okay now?
Yes, excellent.
Can you hear? Okay, all right. Picking up where I was at, the anthropologist Julie Cruikshank, a number of years ago, in examining the Tlingit position in existence, quote, stated that a moral universe inhabited by a community of beings in constant communication and exchange is the form of belief. And that characterization is true of all Alaska Native societies. Within that set of beliefs, humans are a part of an existence comprised of fellow spiritualized entities. Spirits of other living and non-living forms are persons essentially similar to the persons of humans. Existence is relational. That is, the spirits are in contact and they communicate with humans and intend to human action and are entitled to respect. Existence is characterized by cosmological cycling, the continuous passage of spiritual forms, human and other, between this life, death, and return. Existence is moral. Humans have obligations and responsibilities to act in respectful and ritual ways to ensure existential continuity. The concept of relational sustainability is the overarching moral imperative in Alaska Native cultural existence. This is an image that demonstrates what the concept of cosmological cycling refers to. During lived existence from birth, we pass through death to another world, and then that spiritual form returns. This is unlike Western and scientific doctrines. So the attentiveness to the return of the spirit, whether it's human or other, is very critical in the Alaska Native moral approach. Sharing in Alaska Native culture is both an essential feature and the essence of Alaska Native culture. It is at one time a glue that binds people together, maintains communities, and ensures continuity. As a paradox, it is also a lubricant that extends respectful connections with those outside the kindred or extended family, typically involved in this close-knit sharing networks. Sharing is the agent of reproduction. Through sharing actions, Alaska Native cultures pass down through generations and thereby sustains rich and meaningful lives connected together. It is the essence that fulfills and defines being a fully engaged moral human being. What is sharing? Alaska Native languages have many terms, which at this point I won't go into. We'll have to use the English gloss, in which the meaning refers to the transfer of a good or other item, such as subsistence food, owned by one person or group to another. So ownership represents the underlying understanding of property. Someone has the right to be able to transfer this material. It is one of a continuum of practices through which Alaska Native societies and communities transfer materials to sustain their members. In Alaska Native societies, sharing means giving without an explicit expectation of returning. Anthropologists have utilized the term generalized reciprocity developed by Marshall Solins as a way of characterizing understandings and expectations. Thus, there is an underlying understanding and expectation that those who receive have an obligation and will return at some point. That it is through that continuous exchanging back and forth that the concept of reciprocity is evident. Now, this is one type of exchange, is sharing, but there are others that are a part of the matrix of movement of goods and services. This is the legal recognition of these various different categories. Barter, customary trade are also involved as part of subsistence, and there are also non-subsistence exchanges that are identified at the bottom. I would make a point at making the point that shares among work groups is not, in our conceptualization, a part of sharing. Rather, that is a part of allocation. And that is when people work together cooperatively, providing skills, providing knowledge, providing technical materials, providing gas, and other materials, they then have a share in the conceptualization of Alaska Natives in the production. That sharing is what is obligatory and is referred to as allocation. In this particular example, this is the way in which the Inupiat bowhead whalers divide up and share the harvest of a bowhead whale amongst all of the crews and the various different captains who are a part of the process of cooperatively landing and then butchering the animal. So this is what a share refers to. This is an obligatory allocation. From these shares, which are the property of those individuals, then the sharing process will commence and go forward. And it may take multiple levels. What is referred to as primary sharing of the property to the first, secondary, or tertiary as those proceeds move beyond. Why does sharing occur? Alaska Natives give many reasons for sharing, such as, first of all, the meaning of food security. That is, we'll say something more about this, making sure that everyone has enough to be able to meet their needs. Food sovereignty references the desires for specific foods. Our diets, our nutrition, our health requires certain foods, and therefore, through sharing, we can achieve our goals of food sovereignty with regard to these specific foods. It is also critically important to provide for the needs of others. This is a very common reason given. Particularly important are those kinds of foods regarded as specialties or delicacies. And so they will have a more extended network of distribution as many people are brought in to try to experience those particular resources. Another reason given is that Alaska Natives were taught to do so by their families and by the upper generations with who taught them how to obtain these resources. Another important spiritual reason relates back to the principle of the relationality. In Alaska Native thought, animals give themselves to those that fulfill their obligations, one of which is to share. So through the act of giving and sharing, an individual is seeking favor with the animals who they have shared, who will once again be attentive to the needs of the hunter and give themselves. Giving to others is to maintain relations, that lubricant form. And there are strong emotional and spiritual values for giving in terms of the emotional feeling good and whole as a person. So these are the reasons that are given. Here's an important indication of why that traditional giving is so critical to the sustaining of households. The ability to produce is not equally distributed amongst all households and individuals. Rather, research has demonstrated that, in fact, a certain portion of the households in a community, indicated in the far right in this chart called the high third, produce the amount of resources consumed in the entire community that is associated with that percentage that you see. And at the bottom, you see the overall average is that about 76% of production comes from approximately a third of the population. Therefore, that additional production flows through sharing and through the obligatory relationships that we have mentioned before. So this is an underlying critical structural characteristic of how a community's production occurs and why sharing is such a crucial and essential part of that ongoing circumstance. The sharing network range, that is how far are resources distributed, is a function of resource availability. Resource availability in the sense of both what is out there to be harvested and what has actually been harvested. And this chart shows you how the sharing network range is affected by resource availability. So what it shows is that when resources and harvests are above normal levels, the range of distribution of the sharing and the gifting is expanded. When the resources are at a normal level, then there is what you might consider to be the normal range of the sharing network. when resources are below normal, the network is again expanded, because in those circumstances, what it likely means is that certain households have been successful, certain other households have not been successful. Therefore, the range will expand outside of its normal parameters to assist those people as well. When survival circumstances are upon people, that is, availability is drastically below normal, then and only then does the sharing network contract at that point. So who are the recipients of sharing? The evidence indicates that sharing is conducted amongst the term that's called family or extended family. These are the primary recipients in terms of ongoing daily forms of sharing. And you might distinguish the ongoing daily activities of sharing, which are a part of everyday life in rural communities, particularly, where various different resources are being acquired and they are then being transferred to individuals on a relatively daily basis. However, who those represent, it may also be a function of the amount of the resource. As an example, when I was conducting research in the village of Togiak, a Yupik village in western Bristol Bay, I was in the household of one of the individuals that is called a super producer in the literature. A super producer is one of those households or individuals jointly who are in the top third, who produce the enormous amounts. I was in the household of such a producer, and the sons returned from their outing acquiring clams, and they came back with multiple bags of clams, and they had stopped on their way from the beach up to the house to deliver some to various houses, and then the clams were brought into the house and placed upon a very large table. The women of the house then proceeded to get the clams out, and at that time they then sent out the message to everybody in their extended family that the clams were there and to come and get some. I watched as members of approximately 12 different households came and received their sharing of the clams produced by these two men when they had gone out. On another occasion in Togiak, I was aware of the crewmen going out in pursuit of walrus. And when they returned successfully, having harvested the walrus, they came down to the beach and put it on the post. And after distributing the shares through allocation to those hunters and to their family, they then alerted the entire community. And I watched as pickup trucks from all over the community came down and acquired shares of the walrus caught by the crewmen. So this shows you the kinds of daily circumstances in which the recipients of sharing will be mobilized to act and be able to receive their portions. Beyond the family, then, a next category of great importance are the elders. Elders in the community are highly valued, revered even, and it's very crucial for them to be able to receive the food sovereignty, the nutritional, cultural foods that they require. Another category are those who can't provide for themselves, disabled or indigent who lack either the technology, the knowledge, or the skills. Those and other kinds of need who are in short supply for various reasons. There is also a category of people who request resources. This is called demand sharing. And normally providers within the possibilities will take in requests of demand sharing if they have some surpluses that they can allocate to that. And in the modern context, we find that certain institutions now, organizations, especially hospitals where elders are, may also receive shares in order that they may be transferred to Alaska Natives who desire those foods. So how does the Subsistence Resource Sharing Network work? This particular chart is the result of what is called network analysis. That is the systematic interviewing of the households labeled in this community of Deering in Northwest Alaska. And it's a very fascinating chart and revelatory resource. The various different linkages are in different shades, grayer, and those are associated with the amount of flow. So the darker and the thicker the line, the greater the flow of materials. And then you can see in the upper left-hand corner between S and E, you can see the movement of goods from S to E in one bar, and the movement of goods from E to back to S in the other bar. And so what we can see also is this enormous movement of materials between various households, but also that these households are linked. And these are labeled as, in this particular picture, as the Deering A represents a particular network of related kinsmen. These are the kinsmen that are the normal recipients of production from anyone in those households. So too, we can see that Deering D approximates that model of the super producer. Enormous production that goes on, and also linkages out of their own particular cohort of households to other households. So this represents the way in which in a community, households are organized into their kindred units, and then they have additional kinds of units beyond. And so this gives you a very visual replication of how much of these products are moving between whom and over time. What's very important to see in here is the multiple circumstances of counterflows. People recognize the underlying generalized reciprocity and move their goods between each other as they are capable of doing so. So how much actually moves through sharing in these circumstances? Well, this depends upon many factors. Again, the question of the abundance of resource enters in terms of how much can be shared. The question of the frequency, how often does a particular resource enter into the community and become available, will also implicate how much is shared. The cultural valuation of a specific resource. These are such delicacies, for example. I once went with Tlingit people from Cape to one of their sacred traditional sites of acquiring seagull eggs in the spring. And after going out and acquiring the seagull eggs, going out onto the Dekinu, the Hazy Islands, and picking the eggs and carefully placing them in boxes, transporting them back to the boat and traveling 12 hours back to Cape. Before arrival, the captain announced to the village and to the tribe that they would be arriving with these seagull eggs. And they invited all individual parties to come down to the dock. When we arrived, there were 20 to 30 people coming down with their cars, and the seagull eggs were distributed amongst them. So highly valued delicacies are going to be broadly distributed as well. Cultural contexts, which I'll talk about here in a moment, such as ceremonies and celebrations, are also times of enormous kinds of sharing. And the quantities that are shared are often incredibly numerous or abundant, or just very, very large amounts. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So there is an enormous, those contexts represent specialized contexts, which are, again, have an underlying principle of obligation, but sharing is a crucial part of sustaining and reproducing the social and cultural order. These then constitute the kind of obligatory amounts that must be shared in these kinds of occasions. This is a representation of the flows of core resources in the Gwich'in Athabascan village of Venatai, studied in the early 2010s. And this was another wonderful study of networking that shows the entire cohort of resource sources, the entire portfolio. Caribou, geese, bearded seal. Where do they get bearded seal and veneti? Well, they have connections with people in Kaktovik or in Barrow, and they are shared bearded seal, beluga, and bowhead come in significant quantities. But at any rate, as you can see here, the three most significant resources that move at high rates between households are, first of all, caribou in terms of the total amount of poundage. That's the amount of poundage of caribou that moves through these sharing flows. And the N represents the number of occasions in which the caribou has been shared from one individual household to another. You can see that moose are shared more frequently even, but at almost exactly the same level. And the third most important numerically is salmon. So this is a fairly interesting profile in terms of this is the kind of profile that in rural communities with very large portfolios of resources, there will nevertheless be certain resources that you might call the staples. And those are the ones of greatest production and greatest movement amongst the household. That research also gives us an opportunity to look at within all of the households in Veneti, what constitutes the manner in which people consume subsistence foods. It's a very interesting chart. One of the most interesting features is that the own harvest, that is, the household as its own production, produces about 33%. Then in their cooperative harvests, as part of that cooperative harvesting, they received about 23,000. Then as part of their allocation through the share system, they received 13,000. And sharing, meaning the receipt of various subsistence foods from others just as shared, constitutes 21,000 pounds. That 21,000 pounds constitutes 37% of the total amount that particular community then is moving of its total production through sharing to various households. That's a very, very astonishing amount. Some resources move at much higher levels. For example, we'll see it later on, bowhead whale, because of the abundance of that resource. And in some years when the abundance is very high, herring eggs from Sitka also move at high rates. I want to point out at the top that subsistence foods, those culturally preferred foods, note that for a direct trade of one food for another only constitutes 96 pounds, and that the customary trade, or what purchase means, customary trade, the use of cash, constitutes only 530. So the enormity of the sharing and joint production is what constitutes how these materials move between households in the village of Veneti. And similar research was done in Wainwright and Kaktovik, where the portfolios differ, but the patterns of the receipt of shares normally is in this neighborhood of about 33 to 40% of the total amount that produced would move between the households in the community. This particular image, speaking of bowhead whales, as well as other resources, I would say, does in fact come from that research by Kofinas et al. As they obtained interview information from all of the households in Kaktovik. And what this chart demonstrates is the movement of those goods from Kaktovik. And in each case, what we see in the other communities, the enumeration is the number of households to which those materials went. And what is interesting in this, of course, is the incredible extent across Alaska, from Kaktovik even into relatives in Barrow, noteworthy down to Anchorage, 29, which results in an enormous additional secondary and tertiary distribution. Then we can see materials in the lower right being sent to other states, 8 different states. We can also see that relatives, probably most likely in Canada, and the 2 Inuit communities of Inuvik and Aklavik are receiving subsistence goods. And finally, there are individuals related, no doubt, to those people in Kaktovik living in other nations, as you can see at the bottom, who are recipients. So what we can see is when resources are abundant, the imperative to share, particularly with kindred and others, extends far beyond just the local population. And this is a critical nexus of how Alaska Natives maintain access to their traditional foods and also to the ability to be able to share and remain connected to their families in these locations. In Southeast Alaska, this poorly reproduced picture from Dr. Thornton's recent book shows the way in which herring row on kelp, leaf kelp in this case, Macrocystis, is boxed up. I've carried many of those boxes from planes and to planes over my lifetime, carrying them to Juneau. And these are transported from Sitka, and sometimes, as in my case, from Fish Egg Island next to Klawock and Craig. Those eggs are shipped and transported throughout Alaska and into Canada. It's unfortunate that the herring roe harvests have been so poor in recent years, because this is a delicacy important not only for nutritional, but medicinal uses by many Alaska Natives who cherish the ability to be able to consume herring eggs. So let's turn now to talk about the kind of sharing that is characteristic of celebrations and ceremonies. Alaska Natives engaged in numerous celebrations and ceremonies throughout the year, typically in a pattern in which there are hosts of an event who are providing for guests who have been invited to that particular event. Feast is the term used for the formal occasion of a host providing foods to the guest. And the feast is the commonplace and central feature of celebration and ceremony. You can't have one of these things without having food. Food that is, when it is most highly valued, it is traditional foods from the cultural cuisine. Although some people bring cookies, I guess, now, but that's also, I guess, part of it. At any rate, this is an example when people come together to consume the food of what is called commensalism. Consuming food together is considered by some scholars to be a foundational element distinguishing human behavior from that of other species. It is an absolute expression of humanness and a fundamental core foundation of relationship. Food is often also given to guests, not merely in the context of the feast, but as gifts to be taken home from the ceremony. This is particularly true in the context of specific kinds of ceremonies. Ceremonies that mark important social transition, particularly mortuary relationships and other coming of age circumstances, celebrating certain significant occurrences. These are occasions for sharing food. Ceremonial examples in which the sharing of food, the abundant sharing of food, the broad sharing of food to others. The Nalukataq festival that occurs at the end of the bowhead whaling season amongst the Inupiat is when all of the successful captains come together and bring their designated portions to an open area where they are shared with all of the village residents who will come and receive whatever they wish at that particular time. There are many other annual ceremonies in which the whaling captains distribute portions as well, sharing their harvests with others. Amongst both the Inupiat and the Yupik, there is a messenger feast in which a community or a kazagi, in the case of the Inupiat, act as a host, and they are inviting other entities. In the case of the Yupik, this is usually another village that attends, and at the messenger feast, the hosts again are enjoined to produce enormous quantities of food in order to share with others. And I might underscore here the point that will also relate to the Tlingit Kuik, which is that it is in the giving of abundance that you are demonstrating, at one time you're demonstrating your respect and your caring about those who you have invited. And you are also demonstrating, for purposes of status, what your capabilities are. So abundance at these occasions have a dual purpose in both honoring and in affirming status. The Yupik Seal Party is a particularly renowned activity in terms of demonstrating how sharing is this critical glue that goes beyond just merely the food. In this particular case, traditionally on the coast, the acquisition by the individual hunters of their first bearded seal. In Yupik society, traditionally, when the man comes back with his seal, he hands it over to his wife. And in the annual seal party that is conducted upon every year, a man getting his first bearded seal, his wife then portions all of that seal. That singular seal is portioned up, and she delivers it to all of the households of the other hunters in the community. So she's distributing. And so then later on, their household will also receive portions of seal from every other successful hunter. This is an astonishing event that demonstrates the cultural significance of the respect and the bonding by giving the same food by everyone. The seal party also has a special role in Yupik society in social transition, because the achievement of male adulthood is dependent upon the ability of a young man to engage in successful hunting by himself. So on that occasion in which a young man in training with his father for years successfully brings home his own bearded seal, his mother then stages a special seal party. And in this special seal party, she invites the mothers of all of the potential spouses to her son to come and receive portions of his harvest. This is an announcement to all of those other households again that her son is now eligible to be married to one of those daughters. So again, fascinating that the sharing plays this critical social signaling and social transition role in Yupik society. Ceremonial examples, the Dene potlatch, particularly mortuary potlatch, extraordinarily elaborated events which always include feasts and are almost always require the moose. And in fact, one of the critical court decisions in the state of Alaska is built upon this religious principle that at the mortuary potlatch, moose is a part of what must be distributed. So in the Frank case, this was brought to the Alaska courts, and it was determined that as a matter of religious practice, out-of-season moose hunts must be allowed for those parties requesting them. The Tlingit Kuik, also known as the potlatch, is another event similarly often in its most elaborated portions in the mortuary sense of honoring an elder who has passed after a period of time. The spiritual significance of this activity is very important too, in freeing the spirit to be able to return and be reborn, as we saw in the patterning of cosmological cycling. These are images of abundance taken at a kuik I was invited to and intended in the community of Hana years ago. And these demonstrations of abundance, and don't forget to look on the wall at all of the sodas too, are all of these materials which have been carefully prepared. If you see, they all have to be placed in these bowls. And so the hosts have gone to extensive efforts to prepare these things, and their preparations. They are not just slipshardily handed out. They have an aesthetic, pleasing component to them in terms of how the recipients will see these objects. In the upper right-hand corner, then you see the distribution of the first feast, as the young woman is circulating through the attendees and bringing their first feast to them. And finally, in the lower right picture, what you see is, I want to bring your attention to the boxes. And in this case, the boxes you can begin to see being filled up. And these are the gifts that are going to be received. This is the seating of the guests. And as they receive them, they fill up their boxes to be able to take them home. So the largesse that is passed through sharing and gifting on these occasions represents the expression of respect and honor for those that have gone, as well as demonstrating through the amount, the caring of the individuals who host. Alaska Natives also share with their ancestors. Ancestors are present in the daily life of Alaska Native experience. Now, on particular occasions, for example, amongst the Dene, they burn food for the deceased and others at a mortuary potlatch. Through the transfer of the burning smoke, those foods are transported and feed the deceased spirit for them to move in their new domain. Modern day Tlingit use fire bowls, which are a similar form of ways of using burning to transfer food to ancestors. Tlingits conceive of the consuming of herring eggs as having been done with the departed ancestors, as a joint activity with those ancestors who taught them how to obtain them and use them. Tlingits also give food to ancestors on entering places they previously traveled to and requesting their protection in those locations. And Tlingits give tobacco to both ancestors and particularly to the sacred Ixt in their burial sites for their receipt. Alaska Natives also share with non-human persons. The sharing with non-human persons goes back to the notion of favor and this relationality, the continuous relations that go on between individuals. Koyakan leave portions of their caribou or moose harvests for wolves. They do this because they recognize that the wolves have left unconsumed portions of carcasses for humans. That is the Koyakan understanding of the relationship between themselves and the wolves. The Inupiaq give drink of fresh water to the bowhead whales on landing. The Atna leave bits of food for birds and fur bearers when leaving a particular campsite. A particular story of my experience with relationality has to do with going out and fishing for king salmon with the mayor of Klawock on one occasion. And as we got to a particular location, he happened to, where we were going to look for king salmon, he noticed across the way and high in a tree, a bald eagle watching us. And he made note of that particular, and he suggested that we might have a good chance of catching a king. we caught the king salmon. And as he brought the king aboard, as customarily done, he cut down the gut, opened it up, cut out the intestines. And in cutting out the intestines, he then grabbed them, he held them high up above his head, and he pointed them to the area of the eagle. He then threw those intestines into the water behind the boat. The eagle left its perch high above on the water, traveled down, and soon was there, picking up the intestines into its mouth. And as the eagle flew off, the captain said, "Good cheese, uncle." This is an example of how relationality, the fundamental communication, is implicated in sharing. In this particular case, the sharing between the humans and the bald eagle. So these are imperatives to give. In certain contexts, the imperative is to give everything. In certain potlatch contexts, the status, this is especially true in mortuary contexts. But it's also true in times of need, great need by some. Andy Paucan, the Yupik elder, spoke of this value in the film Kayak, about the need, the imperative to give everything when others are in starvation mode. Peter John, revered Panama Chief, spoke of this as a necessity associated with the potlatch, mortuary potlatch. Tekahate, the Tlingit leader from Klawock, who protected and sustained Tlingit ownership of that river, gave a potlatch in 1890, observed and reported on by the US Census Enumerator, who was astonished by the amount and variety of goods given away to 400 persons in attendance. Upon completion of the event, he asked the superintendent in charge of the local cannery, "What more does Tekahate have?" And he says, "He's given it all. He will be in here tomorrow seeking some credit to get some tea." And so this imperative to give all is a traditional part of specific occasions and specific cultural circumstances. Here is Peter John, the Panama Chief, who stated that was the obligation to give all by the hosts and sponsors of the mortuary potlatches for loved one. You can see his dictation of that in the film Hitting Sticks, Healing Hearts. So these abundant patterns of giving and sharing have been assaulted. Alaska Native cultures have received challenges to these cultural practices. Moravian and Catholic missionaries among the Yupik banned mask ceremonies and pressured people to give exorbitantly. As Andy Paucan related, they wanted to have them take on the Protestant activity. And the Yupik were extremely offended in the season of shortage when the missionaries failed to share their supplies with the starving communities. Governor Brady and other missionaries to the Tlingit wanted to halt potlatch because the giving violated Protestant values of saving. To that extent, he talked to Tlingit leaders and invited/demanded them to attend what he staged as the last potlatch in 1904, with the intent that this final celebration would be the culmination for attendees to never conduct the ceremony again. I leave it to your judgment as to whether that particular event was indeed the last potlatch. So there are pressures on sharing that are currently being realized in Alaska Native subsistence. Certainly are circumstances in certain regions where the abundance and availability of resources has been limited. The Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, king salmon runs have been in sharp decline. Even Chignik has lost sockeye runs in recent years. And of course, locally in Southeast, the herring roe have been in such sharp decline for a number of years. A secondary concern is the number of subsistence producers compared to consumers. That ratio, which I previously pointed out at about 70 to 30, is in some villages becoming more like 80% produced by 20. And that's a function of demographic changes as the older producers, that older cohort can no longer enter into production, and they're not being replaced by enough in the younger cohorts. Those charts that you saw of the movement of transportation, let me just go back to the number of subsistence producers. It is also where the producers live. And that is, you'll hear from a talk later on by Dr. Fall, that over 50% of Alaska Natives now reside in non-subsistence regions. And that means that they can't engage in subsistence productions that allows the surpluses and all of the delicacies to be moved. So that's a regulatory feature that is also a pressure on sharing. The cost of transporting resources to non-locals who desire them is also enormous. And it certainly at some point will test the limits. And people have to realize that that is in fact part, and there should be a study done to determine that as a part of the entire valuation. And in some cases, there are changing values that have gone on as well. So ultimately, though, the cultural essence of sharing was well stated by an Utqiagvik captain who stated that the participation in producing and sharing brought contentment, a sense of satisfaction and peace of mind. This is created and nurtured by hunting and providing others with food through sharing. Thus, sharing as a part of that cultural valuation is the realization of identity. It's a linkage to heritage and to ancestors, and it is a provider of emotional and spiritual sustenance in addition to all the wonderful taste that it brings. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to Chuck at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. You can stop sharing if you'd like. Dr. Langdon will now take questions which have been submitted via YouTube. There's one question that I'll raise that I'm wondering, among these super producing households, or 30% of households that produce 70%, is there can you identify a kind of morality among them that towards producing and sharing that's passed down through generations in those families, differentiating them from other households in the community?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I suspect that that we would see generational aspects of that super production, but it is not a total and complete lineage. But it would be being raised in one of those households would absolutely give you both the values and also the technical skills and knowledge for your participation, and no doubt having the resources there. Now, that's not to say that this is an interesting question. I think you're raising the implication is, do someone from another household who is not as productive, can they aspire? Is it a position of aspiration? And traditionally in Yupik society, there's a term called nakalpiak. They don't have caste or hierarchies, and the term nakalpiak is a status of an extremely productive individual. So really what your question gets to, is this an aspirational status that others who may not inherit or have it transferred through their lineal line, can they meet that? That's a very interesting and open question for research going forward. Good question.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was an expert witness in a case of a family in Point Lay who's of a young man in his 20s, early 20s, who was murdered, and he was just entering the stage of maximizing production, which would have lasted for a good 20 years. But he grew up in a family that was very productive and very had wide distribution networks, and so the legal case was about damages and how you calculate damages, and but in this system where you have succession within the family of these super hunters, if you will, or super producers, it gave me the impression that certain families have a way of, and it has to do with what you said a minute ago about knowledge that's passed down within the families, and the skills that are developed through training and through doing these activities with an experienced person, older person in the family group. All of that, I guess, plays a role in this.
Interestingly, I had a similar case. I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was precisely along the same line. A young man was killed in an airplane accident. And I was called upon to generate a model of damages for his lifetime of subsistence production. Yeah, same thing, same issue. Very difficult in the American legal context for them to accept it.
Yeah. How do you think blood quantum is affecting the number of younger producers? Meaning the issue of members growing up, village members growing up and not having the appropriate blood quantum to hunt certain resources.
Well, I don't. It's a very difficult question because I don't know if it's wise to talk about certain aspects of what goes on, but people are very concerned, they're very anxious, and they're very paranoid about it. This is particularly a factor in communities in Gulf of Alaska, regions where the blood quantum has had a very significant impact on the proportion of hunters, and it's getting worse over time. Those communities do face those difficulties. But my sense is that those skills are going to be transmitted. People being raised in those households who may not meet that quantum definition, they will say, "You're not taking who I am away from me." So this is the sensitivity in terms of those things that's ongoing. But it certainly downstream, it may have a more deleterious effects, particularly in the areas where marine mammal harvesting is a very significant part of the activity. On the North Slope, I would think there might be some issues associated with the ability of people to become part of the bowhead whaling crews. This is an iconic activity. It is absolutely at the core of people's identities. And I have not heard of such difficult circumstances yet, although I have heard one Inupiat man decry the fact that some of his grandchildren are eligible and some of them are not to be able to participate. And he finds that an extraordinary violation of his human rights.
Well, we have a number of very appreciative comments. One is, you are a great speaker and I appreciate it. Another is, really appreciate Steve's knowledge. What an asset. Another says, very interesting to learn the sharing traditions of Alaska Natives. Thank you. Um, Another one, thank you for giving your very informative presentation. So we echo those comments. Um,
Well, I appreciate those positive comments as well.
Here's a question. Did colonialism, this is a little bit off, but I'll ask it. Did colonialism negatively impact traditional communal landholding practices in Alaskan indigenous cultures?
Well, the term, I think we're still in a, in a form of colonialism. And indeed, beginning primarily with the coming of US jurisdiction, the erosion of traditional practices, particularly in regard to outsiders. But you'll find, indigenous communities with regard to their subsistence activities, they don't go barging on other people's lands, to put it simply. They're raised in communities where they understand communities, they know what their traditional territories are. So while they can maintain their own traditional relationships amongst themselves, for example, the Gwich'in, they're invaded by hunters in their caribou hunting territories. And those invading hunters disrupt and violate the cultural norms in terms of where hunting is supposed to occur. So their ability to control the territory also uh, uh, hurts in their ability to sustain their relationships with the porcupine caribou herd. I've heard a number of individuals talk with great pain about their inability to, in essence, sustain their practices because of access to their lands in those particular circumstances. So yes, it's a serious issue on many fronts and on many bases with regard to the ability. Let me just reiterate, people will often follow the traditional territorial principles amongst themselves, but those have no standing in terms of the legal policies of access that the state and federal governments allocate.
Here's an interesting question pertaining to that issue, where many Alaska Natives are living in areas where subsistence harvest is not recognized under state law. Is there any sense or indication that sharing still occurs with fish and game taken under sports regulations?
I think that's a very good question, and I have no doubt that it does. But there are also people will use, especially in the Kenai River and also in the Chitna fishery, they will use they are forced to use those fisheries, and I believe that sharing will occur to the extent that they have, and it will be thought of. Specifically, one of the points that I failed to indicate, well, I underscore, is that the ceremonies and the necessity of the ceremonies and the giving of traditional foods in ceremonies is enormously significant feedback on production. So when you know you've got a ceremony 2 years down the road, your production is going, especially of salmon, to be jarred or is going to be impacted this year and next year to get more for those particular circumstances. And so I hope people will continue to pursue those particular avenues that they have. Just on the we know that although not enough people can travel back to their villages to be engaged in their subsistence productivity. But even to do so, they are considered illegal to move back from Anchorage or Fairbanks or Juneau just for the season of production. They would then engage in a traditional harvest and processing that would be an illegal action, although there are a number of Alaska Natives who do engage in that particular activity. So there are various different ways how people try to adjust to and manipulate and maneuver around the legal circumstances that they find themselves in at the present time.
So they must work within that structure of limited harvest bag limits.
Yes.
Under sports regulations, that's a challenge.
Well, sports are very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and seasons and all. So, but that's a issue you're talking about is an issue of residence. You can't. If you're in Anchorage, you can't go back to your home village because you're not a resident.
Right. Same thing in Juneau. Yeah, but people do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much again. This has been very enlightening and very interesting topic that we need to continue to examine and pursue in terms of continuity and expanding opportunities for sharing, because there's a greater need for sharing, particularly now and during this COVID situation.
Excellent points. Yeah, excellent point.
SHI invites viewers to return for our next lecture by Dawn Jackson, entitled Tribal Sovereignty During a Worldwide Pandemic, scheduled for next Tuesday, March 16th. We have a link below the YouTube video for a survey we hope you will take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and also allow our funders to measure the impact of the program. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. You should come down and take a look at the progress if you haven't already. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. Thank you and see you next Tuesday.
Chuck, can you hear me, Chuck?
Yes.
Can you send me the link to the Tom's Cairn lecture?